folks. Welcome back to the third Corax and Coffee podcast. I'm your host, Pete Steele.
And I'm your other host, Rick Hendricks.
And we are back, and we are all about talking about playing games in public, dispelling those stereotypes about gamers being asocial basement dwellers.
Talking about bringing new people into the hobby and pushing back against that stereotype that says you have to leave society behind to join.
That's right.
We're social people, we swear.
We are. We definitely are. And in the name of being social, we actually have a treat today because we actually have brought our producer, Keegan King, with us on the show today.
Hi, everybody.
What's up, Keegan?
Hey, Keegan.
How's it going?
How are you?
Oh, I'm good. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be on this side of the recording for once. It's kind of fun.
We're glad you're here, too. So it'll actually be Keegan and Rick and myself today talking to you about the topic of theme in tabletop games. But before we dive into theme, which we're actually going to have Keegan talk about a little bit, define theme, we do want to give a shout out to our social media manager and editor of all things, Sarah Vasa, and then our game enthusiast consultant behind the scenes person, Miss Shaw. So Keegan, what's the deal with theme in board games or tabletop games?
Well, I am so glad you asked. The theme is togetherness. No, so I looked at, actually, I wanted to get like a pretty good definition here because I think, when I think of theme, I think of genre. You know, I'm a musician by art, by trade. I don't know. And so normally that's kind of how I put it together. The selections you'd see at like a Barnes and Noble. But I did find a pretty good definition here. This is from boardgaming.com. So good source, I suppose. But it says that a game theme refers to the subject matter that the game is built around. The theme could be very abstract, like shapes, or a game could be very story-driven and have a theme like mystery. And I like this definition because it covers sort of how broad and how ridiculous theme can really be. I mean, theme is sort of the umbrella by which the rest of the game exists under from a storyteller perspective. So that could be like science fiction or fantasy or horror. But I also like the idea of theme being a little bit broader too. So that's, when I think of theme, that's kind of where I sit.
Right, okay. And I think there's an important distinction to be made between theme, which as you said is very broad, and something more specific like a setting. Mm-hmm. If we have a theme of science fiction, one setting that's possible within science fiction is Star Trek. Another one would be Star Wars. And if you were talking about the theme of fantasy, well then Middle Earth would be the setting or the world in which that fantasy theme takes place. But you can also have, it doesn't have to be one of these well-known intellectual properties for a world. Your setting or your world could be Boston in the fall. That's a perfectly legitimate setting. And you could have almost any theme you wanted in the setting of Boston in the fall, including horror or mystery or whatnot.
And it might even have a bit more punch if you set it somewhere more familiar.
Exactly, yeah.
So, speaking of punch, there's also a third sort of axis to this when we talk about story in a big sense, and that is tone. So tone is the emotion of the piece. A game which takes itself seriously and portrays a desperate struggle for survival is going to feel very different from one that laughs at itself. You have a couple of works that share their theme and setting in Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Lower Decks. Same theme, same setting, but they have wildly different tones in how seriously they take each other. In the same vein, you can have cartoon zombies versus very graphic zombies with blood and a lot of realism. This can appear both in the art and in the narrative text to really show that difference between, is this a, haha, John's a zombie now, or, oh, John's a zombie. Okay, we need to get out alive, and then we need to tell his daughter.
So I know it seems like we're kind of splitting hairs here between theme, setting, and tone, but they are really distinct ways of thinking about content or material, and they can give a tabletop game a very distinct feeling, which is involved. The feeling comes from the artwork and the narrative and the combination of those things and components and whatnot. So you can have a theme of fantasy in the setting of Middle Earth with very different tones, or you can have science fiction in different settings with very different tones, or the very different settings but the same tone, and so on and so forth. So these distinctions are a little bit important. But you can also have lack of theme, which I think Keegan alluded to earlier.
Yeah, no, exactly. I'm trying to think of what I would say about that. I mean, yeah, you can definitely have a lack of theme. A lack of theme in the way that we're talking about it, right? Like, so a lack of theme in the sense of like a lack of genre. One of the ones that comes to mind right off the bat would be like abstract strategy games, right? Like, it's a situation where the theme does not change how the game is played. So, like, I always jump straight to like Stratego when I think of this, or a game like Sequence. These are games that tend to have no luck element at all. It is about how you play with the pieces. Tend to have direct conflict. So chess is another example, or Go is another example. And they tend to have no real hidden information. And so is it a theme? Yeah, I would say so, because like it is an umbrella by which games exist. And there's a lot of games, as I've just listed, that exist underneath them.
But it is possible to have a game where you don't talk about zombies or war or any of these other obvious themes, and you can really focus more on these are the mechanics of the game. This is how we want the game to make you feel and make you think. And some games are really better off without a theme. Obviously chess has done very well, and if you added more war to it and a monologue after each piece died, I don't think it would improve the game.
Yeah, exactly.
So a lot of pattern and puzzle games tend to be abstract and lack a clear theme like this.
So let's actually talk about a couple of pattern and puzzle type games that really have very little, if any, theme whatsoever. So one that I've been playing recently, actually, with Sarah, is Project L, which just came out in 2020. And it was published by Boardcubator, and it uses Tetris-like Tetraminos. If you remember Tetris from the 80s and 90s, where you had the different colored 4 square shapes. You had the 4 in a line, and then you had the block and the L and the T and so on and so forth. So Project L uses those. And they're not all Tetraminos, because some of them have only 2 squares or 3 squares or 1 square rather than having them all 4. But rather than in Tetris, you having them fall down and you're trying to complete lines, you're taking these components and you're completing little puzzles to gain points and also gain additional shapes so you can complete larger puzzles. The components, guys, for this game are incredible. The pieces are colorful. I mean, you could throw a whole bunch of them in your OJ and take them out, dab them off, and they would be fine. The cardboard puzzles...
So sturdy.
They're very sturdy. The cardboard puzzles, don't put OJ on those maybe, that you put the Tetraminos on are double layered so they don't scoot around. The game takes 5 minutes to teach, if that, 15 minutes to play. And if you play it once, it's really like eating salty peanuts. You play a game, you're like, oh, I like this. Let's play again. And it's like $35. Very cheap to pick up.
Nice.
A second game I want to talk about, which is also very much in the puzzle theme of abstract games, is Illusion, which is a couple years older, 2018, I want to say, published by Pandasaurus. This is like 3 minutes to teach, 10 minutes to play. You can play almost anywhere. It's a deck of cards you can put in your suit pocket, and it's pictures of different colors, and all you have to do is arrange them in order of the percentage of blue, green, red, and yellow that are in each picture, and you have to put them in order. So you pick one color. So you say the color for the round is red, and you put down a card, and then you put down a second card, and it's like, oh, I think this card has more red in it than the previous card. So you put the card with more red to the right. And you kind of go around the table, players placing cards where they think they should go based on how much red is in the picture. And then players can either say, oh, I agree, or they can challenge. And if they challenge and they're right, they get a point. If they challenge and they're wrong, then you get a point. And that's the entire game.
Who determines if they're right?
So on the back of each of the cards, if somebody challenges, if a player challenges, you flip over all the cards, and then you have the corresponding percentages on the cards.
That's pretty cool sounding, actually. I like that.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, again, you can teach this game in 3 minutes and play it in 5 or 10, if that. I'm not really convinced necessarily that it's a full game. I know the definition of game is a slippery slope, but I'm like, is this a game or is this an exercise? Either way, it's fun to engage in. And you can pick this up for like 10, $15.
Oh, cool.
I like that idea of struggling with, is this a game or is this an exercise? But I think you're right in that that's going to be a much longer episode for me to pour over and edit.
Oh, sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that could be a whole season right there, and I don't think anyone would want to come along with us for that. But we can dream.
So anyway, we were here to talk about theme, and then we jumped right into games that don't have a theme.
We sure did.
So let's talk about some games that actually do.
Okay.
Well, fine.
One really common theme is adventure. Adventure games usually revolve around danger and often fold in some exploration of the unknown. This is an easy theme to adapt to different time periods and different settings, but there's typically a lot of action to it. If you're doing a lot more thinking or planning, it's likely to be a different sort of game. It tends to involve characters that players control, gaining more power through increasing their stats and or gaining equipment.
I think that's kind of cool. This immediately makes me think of every pirate game Pete has tried to get me to play at some point in our friendship.
I do love a pirate game.
You do love a pirate game.
Do you love any ones in particular?
So I could go on and on and on for hours about pirate games. So I won't do that here. I won't put you all through that. But I do want to mention a couple. So an entry-level pirate game that's entry-level for two reasons. One is that it's good for newcomers to the gaming community. And two, it's really great for younger kids who either enjoy gaming or are new to gaming, but an 8-year-old can play a game called Plunder, A Pirate's Life, which just came out in 2020, published by Lost Boy Entertainment. The components, especially the ship components, are fantastic. So you have this board, which is a bunch of islands, and you start with one ship, and you can upgrade it with additional sails and cannons and additional sailors, which are essentially your hit points. And you sail around to different islands to get points. You're trying to get plunder points. And the first player to 10 plunder points wins the game. They're victory points, right? Mm-hmm. And you're sailing around, fighting, plundering to get different components to upgrade your ship and win plunder points, aka victory points. It's a little bit slow mechanically for non-kids because you have a very limited number of actions per turn. So I found that as I was playing the turn, I'm like, oh, I want to do more in a turn. And if this were a more advanced game, I would be doing more in a turn, but I just have to wait.
And that's what it makes it so good for kids and for beginners.
Exactly. You don't have to keep that much in your head. I would buy this so I have, I'm an uncle of 4 now. I have 3 nieces and 1 nephew that was actually just born yesterday.
Congratulations again on that, by the way. That's super cool.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Mom and nephew are healthy. So he's a little bit young for Plunder.
Yeah, just a bit.
It's a little bit, it'll be a few years, but my nieces are getting up in just the next year or two where I would absolutely buy them this game for their birthday or for a holiday or just because. On the opposite end of the spectrum is a game called Skull Tales Full Sail, which came out, I think, in 2019, published by Eclipse Editorial and Van Ryder Games. The rules are a mess. Where Plunder, you can get through the rules in 15, 20 minutes. The Skull Tales rules will probably, you need to commit an hour a day for a week and a half to these rules. And then you're going to have to read them again and whatnot. But the developers are trying to put out a new version of the rules that are better. Massive amounts of cards. It's really a narrative storytelling game with probably almost 300 cards of different types and sizes and things like that. I mean, if I had a month with no obligations, I would just go to an island on a hotel and play Skull Tales for a month, and it would be amazing. Unfortunately, life doesn't work that way, but it really is a fully immersive narrative storytelling adventure pirate game, which I just think is amazing.
Very crunchy mechanically, though.
Very, very crunchy, very fiddly. And again, the rules are not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, which is not unlike a real pirate, which is great.
Which is not unlike Real Pirate. And Keegan, if you don't like pirates for adventure games or anything else, how do you feel about the stereotypical American Wild West?
A lot of my feelings are probably things we shouldn't share on this particular podcast, but if you want to follow me for my weird, hot political takes, no, I'm just kidding. I do actually really like...
Yeah, no.
My dad brought me up on Westerns. So yeah, I mean, American West is a cool one.
So if people are into adventure games, but aren't really quite ready for full-on immersive narrative games, and don't really want to get into role-playing, which is kind of a type of adventure, let's be honest, and if you like the theme of the Wild West, for lack of a better term, the American West of the 1850s, 1860s, try Western Legends, which came out in, I want to say, 2018, published by Colossal Games. It's a sandbox type of game. And what I mean by sandbox is that you have a number of action points on any given turn to do things, and then basically there are like 10 or 12 or 15 different things you can do with those action points, and what you do is up to you. Do you want to be an outlaw? Do you want to be a deputy? Do you want to rob a bank? Do you want to herd cattle? Do you want to pan for gold? You can do any or more of these things. Do you want to gamble? Do you want to get into a gunfight? And actually, they have an expansion after this game called Ante-Up, which came out in 2019. And there's actually, I just learned this last week, there is a new expansion, a second expansion coming out for Western Legends, coming out either at the very end of 2021 or the beginning of 2022, called Blood Money, and I can't wait to get it. I'm so excited to play.
Joking aside, that actually sounds pretty neat. And you know, I spend a lot of time playing games like Red Dead Redemption, and like this sounds like a really cool like way to maybe get away from the screens for a bit.
It really is Red Dead Redemption, the board game, in a lot of ways.
And still being supported, which I like to see.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, Colossal Games has got a pretty good track record for that, like overall. But it is neat seeing more and more expansions. Pulling away from action games, another like just thinking more about themes and sitting here and staring off into space. I think a little bit about things like city building and civilization games. Do you guys know much about these? Pete, I know you do, but Rick, you know, you and I are still getting to know each other.
Yeah, a little bit.
What I love about these games is this idea of combining exploration or military strength or economics, or just generally seeking out opportunities to make your civilization or your city stronger and better. God games is a term that I hear a lot in sort of in relation to this, where you're sort of picking at and controlling the lives of all your little people. I don't know, just it's neat to me. It's kind of cool to see how that stuff games out. These games also, just for those back at home, the way that you sort of do a lot of these things is less Michael Bay explosions and more using technology or advancing trees of some kind, where you're sort of taking your civilization through the ages, Bronze Age all the way through the, I guess what would be called the Silicon Age at this point. Mm-hmm. Skill play sort of involves also like being rich and powerful, but also flexible, which is what's a big part of these games. And it's kind of neat because you're juggling all of these things at once. For someone like me who likes a lot of input in my games, it is one reason that you see me playing video games. But something, again, I hear that, like, leveled against board gaming that, like, isn't true. Does this make any sense? Am I just rambling?
No, I'm with you. And, you know, you and I have talked about this before, Keegan. If you mention, or if anyone mentions to me either technology trees, or empire building, like, I'm automatically in. You've got my buy-in, my investment. I will sit down and play that.
How can you not be? It's like getting to build something based on your personality, but also getting to put a little bit of yourself in the game, which is not always common in every genre, or in this case, theme. So the theme of city building and civilization is really cool.
I think that, I mean, not always. There are some exceptions, which we don't need to get into right now, maybe. But when it comes to empire building and technology trees, when I hear one or both of those, and they often go hand in hand, what I think is, oh, there's a lot of replayability here. There is more than one way to play this game. Is there more than one way to play and win? Well, we're just going to have to sit down and find out. But that says to me, I can sit down and play this, and whether I win or I lose or somewhere in between, I'm going to learn something, and I'm going to learn how to play this better the next time. And I probably will want to play again.
It's always really fun to look at what you think is the least viable way to win and say, you know what, I'm going to try and do it just with propaganda or just with science or however that happens to be. Because winning the way you didn't think was possible to win is always more fun than just winning the way everybody wins.
And you might actually pull it off.
Yeah, I was saying, talk about adding replay value too, right? Like, the more ways you can play a game, well, the more you get out of it. And Pete, you mentioned a game earlier that was like $30. Like, that's not terrible, but you see some games that come in like 50 or 60, and I feel like this is a good, like, not excuse, but a good reason to have a game be that you're getting all this extra stuff.
So there's a lot of overlap here with 4X games, which for those who aren't familiar is explore, exploit, expand, and exterminate. But many civilization games tend not to involve the extermination. You don't get to wipe your opponent off the map, so it's more about controlling the space and, controlling your tech tree. But if somebody puts a city down where you don't want it, just got to work around it.
And this is, a full-on topic for another episode, but I tend to think that true traditional 4X games are going the way of the dinosaur, because they're very, very popular in terms of theme and mechanics, except for the extermination component, in that, this is really a game mechanic of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And what game designers have learned and what the community has learned is that if somebody is going to sit down and invest in learning an hour's worth of rules and play a game for 3 hours and then get wiped out only to have all of their friends play for another 3 hours and then be the snack person, like, that's not fun. And so I really think that the exterminate in modern 4X games is going away, and it's being replaced by almost a respawn function. So it's kind of turning into 3X1R. I don't know. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
Right. Which I actually think is a positive thing. I think is a positive thing, by the way.
Your explanation here always makes me think of, like, we're seeing a lot of 3X games also just coming out. The one that comes to mind is Eminent Domain. We won't talk about this one right now, but, like, it is a game where the exterminate function is an expansion. And so it is kind of cool, like, you're still seeing these because I like the exterminate mechanic, but I'm also older, and I've been board gaming for a while, and so I've already bought in. But it's interesting to hear that, because it makes me just kind of consider that there's these games that come out, the base game, really fun exploration, really about this power struggle and dynamic. And then, if you really want to, you can jump in with the spiky bits.
And to be clear, I'm with you, Keegan. Like, I have no issues sitting down and playing a game for 3 hours, knowing full well that I will get wiped out and there will be another full half of the game, because I've been gaming for that long as well. I do think, though, that people who are newer to the hobby, where that is less of a mechanic, have a harder time with that particular exterminate mechanic.
Well, and a huge problem with it is, if you and I and Keegan and Christina are playing a game that allows us to eliminate a player, which one of those players is likely to be eliminated first?
Christina, Rick, being your lovely wife, which for
Indeed.
Yes.
She's likely to go first because she doesn't understand these systems as well as we do. She isn't as into it.
Yeah.
And then you're asking her to sit on the sideline for half an hour, and that's just not a winning strategy for the hobby as a whole.
Right, and not if you want people to come back.
Exactly. It's where that exploit mechanic starts to rear its ugly head in some cases. Like when it comes like economic and science and stuff, you're really your own worst enemy in those things, which I think a lot of people more enjoy. I've seen this at least with my partner, Miss Shaw. Like, you'll sometimes see, I made a mistake, but if I'm the one that made the mistake, that's not going to lead to a bad feeling or a bad experience gaming. But if it's that Keegan's picking on me because he's exploiting something that I've done, and created an engine of terrible cards to do horrible things, then it's just not fun. And I don't do that to her, but I do that to other people.
Oh my. So why don't we talk about a couple of Civilization games quickly? So one game that I want to mention is actually Civilization: A New Dawn, which came out in 2017. And it is really a re-implementation of the Sid Meier Civilization games. That's what it is through and through. It was actually developed by James Kifnin, and published by Fantasy Flight. The problem with the game, in my mind, and this is not just my opinion, is that unlike Sid Meier's Civilization games, which were kind of light on direct conflict, depending on the iteration, the Civilization of New Dawn was very light and almost had non-existent direct conflict, which was seen as really negative. But it did have an expansion that came out just last year in 2020, Terra Incognita, which corrected that a little bit and gave a little bit more direct conflict into the game, which made the game overall much better. However, the game I really want to talk about, boys, is Clash of Cultures Monumental Edition, which just came out in 2021, about a month ago, by WizKids. The Monumental Edition is really the second edition of this game, the first edition coming out in 2012. It's got new artwork, new sculpts. It incorporates the expansion of the 2012 version of the game into the base game of the current version. It's got streamlined rules. It's pretty, it's beautiful, but it will set you back between 120 and 150 bucks, depending on where you shop.
Good one to try out before you buy if you can.
Try before you buy, for sure.
Thank God for board gaming cafes. Oof.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
And I actually have seen this game in Shuffles, which is a board gaming cafe near where I live in Tulsa currently. At least one board gaming cafe has picked it up, has invested in a copy of this game, which was just published.
Nice. Glad to see him keeping on top of it.
Yeah.
I think this flows nicely, Pete, into something that I've also been thinking about. Speaking of conflict, one of my favorite gaming types is fighting and arena games.
It would be.
It would be my thing.
Yeah.
Give me a fighting game any day of the week. I lean into conflict. But fighting games, and so for people wondering, board games do have a fighting game style, right? Mm-hmm. Essentially, they are games that encourage players into specific small-scale combat encounters. So you guys, we did that episode on war games, like simulating like the Battle of Gettysburg or something.
Yep.
A fighting game would be more small scale, so it would be simulating a specific encounter between two combatants or two small platoons. Another type that's very similar here is like arena games. And arena games pull back the lens a little bit so that you have your small group of fighters having a spat in like a specific arena. This could be like gladiators in the Colosseum. A really popular one you see is like kaiju fighting over Tokyo.
Yes.
Which reminds me of a bunch of different games. Specifically, The King of Tokyo, but I'm going to skip over that to get into the game that I really want to talk about. The Exceed fighting system game. Have you guys ever played this?
Afraid not.
I've actually not played this. I've heard you talk about it before, but I've never played.
Oh, God, it's so fun. So it's by a D. Brad Talton Jr., which is already the coolest name, and produced by Level 99 Games. They actually produce a lot of fighting games. The Exceed fighting system is one of many 2D fighter games that they put together. And really, the basics of it is it's for two players. You've got this pad in front of you, and each of you gets to pick a specific character. So in the Exceed fighting system game, the core game, it's a bunch of fighters they've created. But what's really cool about this particular series is that they've also licensed them. So for 2D fighter fans like me, you guys can play as Blaze Blue characters or Guilty Gear, which are both really popular 2D fighting games. Mm-hmm. Even more fun, you can play as like Shovel Knight, which is a really popular indie game, which is pretty neat. And basically, it's a super fast 2D fighting game system that allows you to create different combos using punches and kicks and super abilities to basically try to like punch, kick, and quarter circle, double jump, kick to the face your enemy. It's really fun, and it's fast paced enough that like even if you lose, you can jump back into the game pretty quick. I'd say 15 minutes maybe. I've seen it listed anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes as far as like a time goes.
Gotcha.
I'm gonna have to check it out.
Yeah.
So let's talk about one more arena fighting game before we move on. And I want to talk about Super Fantasy Brawl, which just came out in 2020, published by Mythic Games. And like most Mythic games, this game, Super Fantasy Brawl, is just extra. The box is huge. You open it up, you see a lot of empty space. You see a lot of plastic containers holding massive plastic miniatures and other pieces of terrain. I mean, this is... You might be able to play it in a cafe if you had a larger cafe table, but if you took one look at the box, you'd think there's no way this would fit in a cafe table. Mm-hmm. It's just a lot of plastic, which is both cool and kind of obscene in the same way. Mm-hmm. But it's this fantasy setting where you just have 2 or 3 fighters in a coliseum and you're just beating the hell out of each other. And it has a deck building element, so you actually have a unique deck of cards.
For each character?
I think it's for each player. I haven't played it in a while.
Okay.
I've only played it, I'm pretty sure it's for each player, maybe for each character, or maybe you combine characters into one player deck.
More broad, though, like more broad deck building, not like a specific character deck building.
Right, exactly. And I love cards. You give me a big stack of cards, I'm all in. And I like deck building specifically. And I know some people don't like the mechanic of having a deck of cards that controls dudes on a map. I understand some people think that's kind of a abstract or indirect joystick. I understand the complaint.
Those people have not played Summoner War.
Those people have not played Summoner Wars, it's true. But I actually really appreciate this type of mechanic generally. So if you're into big miniatures that can be painted but also look fantastic unpainted, if you like cards and deck building, if you like fantasy, you like beating people up in an arena, check out Super Fantasy Brawl.
Fun. So another type of game is economics.
That's a big shift from fighting in arenas to economics, I have to say.
Well, not all conflicts are
Yeah, I
physical.
was about to say, I'm sure there's a couple manifestos that would disagree with you there.
That's fair. I was just, as soon as I said it, I thought of Wolf of Wall Street. I'm like, okay, maybe not. Maybe it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Are you guys here for these? Are you guys listeners here for these deep cut finance jokes? They're great.
All right, Rick, economic games.
Economic games revolve around the value of more than one resource, and they get heavily into strategic trades and math. They often have sub-themes of banking, stocks and bonds, labor pools, all that good stuff.
So, Rick, you just said a whole bunch of words that I'm all about, but I know a lot of people are like, oh my goodness, math. Am I going to have to do algebra and calculus to play these games? What would you say to that?
I would say that with pretty much every sort of game, we've got developers aiming for different audiences. So there are probably going to be a lot of these that have a good deal of math, and there are going to be a lot that are much more simple and more based on strategy and negotiation.
Fair enough. So something for everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
I think about the game Exchange that just came out in, I want to say 2019. Have y'all heard of this one?
I feel like I've heard you talk about it, but not like independently.
Okay. So this game was actually published by Bicycle of all people, as in Bicycle cards, like playing cards.
Like the playing card
Like
people.
the playing card people, exactly. And you'd think that, like, on the one hand, that the Bicycle company would be like, hey, we're Rich Fest because we sell tons of playing cards, let's make a bunch of board games. And maybe on the other hand, they're like, hey, we're Rich Fest, we can sit back and be Rich Fest. But they did. They made this board game called Exchange, and it definitely has less of a theme than many other economic games, but it also isn't wholly abstract either. It is a low theme stocks and bonds economic trading game, and it's great. If you look at it on the shelf, if you're in a board game store, or they might actually have this game at Target, you would look at the cover and say, absolutely not, this is not for me. The cover is bland, it is boring, it is abstract. Don't let that dissuade you. Pick up this game. It's fantastic. It's probably runs you $25-30. You can learn it in 20 minutes. You can play it in 20 or 30 minutes with 2 to 4 players. It definitely has a lot of take that mechanics, being you gain something by hurting somebody else, and definitely not everybody's into that. But just the simplicity of the theme and the simplicity of the mechanics, so this game makes no apologies of how cutthroat it is really, I would almost say, elegant.
Exchange is a game where you can leave your calculator at home, huh?
You can leave your calculator at home, for sure.
Apparently your morals, too.
Oh, yeah, no, there are no more. There's absolutely no morals in this game. And I don't want to say it ruins friendships, but play it with your close friends who can leave a game at the table afterwards. And if you don't like it, you're only out $20 and you pass it on to somebody else. But I would definitely say don't let the boring cover keep you from picking it up if you're into cutthroat economic games. So that's exchange.
It's funny that you mentioned that because, like, when I think about economic games, I go because I love math, but again, my partner doesn't love it. So I would always go the opposite direction. And this is a game she introduced me to, which we could talk about some of the deeper themes there. But a game called Jaipur that came out in 2009. You guys ever heard of this one?
You were talking to me about this last week.
Yeah. Jaipur, one of the cool things about this game that we could talk about is that it's very small, very compact. You could throw this in a backpack, maybe even your front pocket. And it's a total economics game that's super, super fun to play. It takes place in sort of early Ottoman Empire. But you're basically just a person who works at a stall in a marketplace. And your job is to have the best stall, have the best stuff, and get people to buy and sell from you specifically. Sebastian Pouchon, I believe is how you pronounce his name, was a designer. It's produced by GameWorks, so this is like a fairly large company. But yeah, it's pretty cool. So you and your opponents sort of buy up things. Inflation affects the prices and lets you sort of do all these cool things. Or you could opt to buy camels, which you cannot sell, but they can help you win, which is a lot like life. But I can't qualify that metaphor, so we should probably move on.
I'm still wondering how the camels help you win.
Honestly, I want to tell you how the camels help you win because it has something, I could just tell you. The mechanic is that when they work together, they help you buy more product and move things around quicker. Broadly, I mean, I don't want to give away too much because it is a pretty small game. Nice thing about Jaipur is that it's so tiny and like 2-player compact. We picked it up in about 10 minutes and played it for about 2 hours because it was just fun.
Can you name the camels?
I did. People found it very annoying, but I thought it was pretty fun to go with like Athos, Porthos, Aramis, and D'Artagnan.
There you go. I mean, I just figured, if you can't sell them, you may as well like make a personal bond with them, right?
Yes, and they get shuffled back in. So it is there's a little tiny bit of deck building, but I hesitate to use that term for this game just because it's so simple, and I want to stress that you can definitely leave the calculator at home.
So zooming out a little bit from camels, we have political games.
Which is really right next to economic games.
Exactly. It's again, just a little bit of a zooming out, paying attention to things that aren't money. So these games generally utilize a lot of deduction, shifting power dynamics, and generally a lot of lies and hidden information, which is always fun. And they usually wind up with one player ending up on top. This could be something like trading or controlling information. It has some overlap with financial games, but it could also be something more like trying to successfully gain control of a nation through backstabbing and destabilizing.
So I will say, I love nothing more than sitting down at a gaming table and looking a fellow player right in the eyes and just lying to them and them having no idea. I think that is phenomenal. And
so much fun.
It's so much fun. And it's best where there's a game mechanic where it's in their best interest to trust me, except when it's not. Especially when they know that within the context of a game, I'm going to default lie to them. Distrusting me is going to be tricky for them. However, I will say that it is important to keep the line confined to the game, and we're not condoning lying here on Corex and Coffee.
Only when it's a game mechanic.
Only when it's a game mechanic.
Only if it will gain you things that at the risk of hurting someone else.
Let's move right
we'll go
past
over this
that.
in more detail later here.
I have interacted with plenty of players that are just, even within the context of a game and mechanic, are not comfortable with lying. So, and if someone's not comfortable with something, they're not comfortable with something, and that's the end of the conversation. When you do sit down with a group of people, especially people who are new to games, with a game that has a type of dishonesty or lying component, please make sure that they are cool with it, because very often if they're not cool with it, then they just won't engage with that mechanic. That will lead them to having a severe disadvantage in the game, and then that's just not fun for them or many other people. So,
and at some point we should have a serious conversation about consent in gaming, and I think this political gaming is an important place to discuss consent as well, because politics can also be a really challenging conversation for people. So There's a lot of things to consider. And I say that knowing full well that the game I'm going to talk about, because it made me think about lying and subterfuge, is called Secret Hitler. And I want to point out that that is a real... I love this game, but if I would make any critique, it's that name is not great.
It's not. It's not great.
Very confrontational when it doesn't need to be.
Yeah, exactly. This game was developed by Mike Boxleader in 2016 with Tommy Morangis, I believe is how you pronounce that name. Tommy or Mike, if I'm screwing up your names, you could call me and tell me, and I would just be cool and giddy to talk to you. I don't know that I'll change it or edit this episode, but I'll still be happy. One of the things that is really cool about this game is it's also self-published. So by Goat Wolf and Cabbage, a self-publishing company these two came up with. And this is a social deduction game, and this is part of why I think we could maybe drop the Hitler part of it, because it's a pre-World War II game where it's partly about attempting to pass liberal or fascist laws, depending on what side you're on. And so you're trying to pass, like everyone else is trying to pass liberal things, and the quote-unquote, the secret bad chancellor and the rest of the fascists are trying to pass fascist laws at the same rate, and you're all kind of negotiating and lying to one another to make that happen. This secret Hitler piece is that you're also trying to get elected chancellor, so everyone gets to vote on who's the chancellor for the round. So if the three of us are playing, we get to have these votes.
Yep.
And if whoever is the secret Hitler of the moment gets elected, then they immediately win the game, which we can also talk about how dark that is. Mm-hmm. But it's really cool. One of the things I do like about Secret, I'm leveling some complaints at it. It is a really fun game as long as you've had this consent conversation and you're all agreeing to this theme and this style of game. I also kind of want to just quickly throw out, this is also a game that is technically free, meaning that you can pay what you want versions are digitally available online. Obviously, you have to pay for the cutting and printing and stuff at like your local Kinko's, but the game files are free. Because of Creative Commons, BYNC SA 4.0, do you guys know this whole Creative Commons thing?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
For those of you listening, Creative Commons, a lot of games are going on this have a free version style. And what's really cool is that this sort of allows for there to be amendments, remixes, transformations to the original game. The one rule to keep in mind is that to keep these games free, even if you make a bunch of changes, so even if you change it to Secret Chancellor, which could help you get the consent to play this game, do know that you can't then sell your new version of the game. The whole idea is that if you're going to take it for free, it's always got to be free. For all the harsh things they leveled to it, I do have to say they did a really nice job with this part of the marketing.
Right. And if you want to buy a full-blown retail version with quality components, you can drop $35 and you can have a really nice thing.
Exactly.
If that's what you want to do.
So does this have a lot in common with the game Mafia?
You know, kind of. It is I would say it's in the family. It definitely gets invited to Thanksgiving, although there is no talk of politics at the table. There's more things you can do.
But I guess in Secret Hitler, it doesn't look like you get rid of players.
No, not at all.
As you're playing?
Not at all.
Okay, so that is a major difference.
Yeah. There also is a win condition of passing more liberal policies over the course of the game. So at some point we'll have to talk about win conditions versus end conditions, and this is kind of a nice example of that.
So if we shift and talk about a very different type of game that is under the political theme, and hopefully people are getting a feel for the fact that you can have radically different games with radically different game mechanics that are under the same theme. Another political game that I think is worth mentioning is Twilight Struggle.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I want to say this game first came out in 1997, but I think the current supported published edition came out in 2005. So it's a little bit older, but it's something that you can still pick up at your local brick and mortar or online retailer. Twilight Struggle by Anata Gupta and Jason Matthews by GMT Games. And this is I was going to say I don't want to say simulation, but I actually do want to say simulation. This is it is a narrative simulation of the Cold War, of the 45-year Cold War of the United States against the USSR. And it is fairly low complexity. It's fast-paced, depending on how you play. But basically, you draw events from a deck of cards, and you attempt to exert power on your opponent and control parts of the world with your influence based on real historic events, hence the simulation. And it's fantastic. And I would almost argue that this is an educational game as well, because there's a lot of information on the different cards. I mean, don't take this to your history test, right?
Sure.
There's a lot of historical information on these cards about events that actually happened during this 45-year period. And it's a strictly two-player game, I suppose. You could play teams. There's no need to play teams. There's nothing added by playing teams, but you could. So it's really a two-player game. And it has a lot of replay value. You can play as the United States over and over and over again. But when I first played, as soon as I played the United States, I was like, oh, now I want to be the Soviets and see how that plays out. And I learned by playing the Soviets, I can play the United States better now. Yeah. So Twilight Struggle.
It's really neat because it gives you, something I've really liked about Twilight Struggle is that it gives you both sides of the story in a way that
yes,
neither side really comes out looking great, which is, I think, important.
Absolutely.
But also, neither side is villainized. It really is a game that talks a lot about politics and how politics has to be necessarily sort of in this gray area. And I think Twilight Struggle does a nice job of that, like, nuance.
Everyone has a motive that makes sense to them. And yeah, it's very difficult to see anyone as being entirely in the wrong.
100%.
So, political games. If we shift from political games onto something that on its surface seems a lot lighter and more airy, we might shift to something like, I don't know, train games.
Oh yeah, train games. There are a bunch of these. These are games that evoke that era when trains were king. Obviously, we still have trains today, but it used to be that was the only way to get somewhere. Well, the safest way to get somewhere without getting scurvy halfway along the way. So this is that era where there are places to go that have already been explored. There's a bit of civilization out there, but there's a lot of places that are still wild, and there's a lot of opportunity along the rails. A subgenre of this theme are 18XX games. 18XX standing for the 1800s. There are dozens of these. And they have a lot of economic elements, again, moving resources via the trains and, a lot of these games.
Yeah, well, of course, one of the main ones that we would be silly to not discuss is Ticket to Ride from 2004. Although, honestly, to say from 2004 is not even fair because there's probably I'd say conservatively 70 versions of this game.
At least. I want to be clear, though, that Ticket to Ride is not an 18XX game.
No.
I think the original theme around it, I think it's the early 1900s, if I'm not mistaken. Ticket to Ride is really cool, though. So Ticket to Ride is, just for those of you listening, it's a game by Alan R. Moon, produced by Days of Wonder, who do a lot of really fun games. Ticket to Ride, I think one of its best qualities as far as a train game, though. Ticket to Ride is a nice sort of dipping your toe in a very nicely explained version, and it's existed for almost 20 years now. So there's a lot of iterations and a lot of versions that have come out. It's good for families. It's a good way to get in, and it does really whet your appetite for sort of this controlling a small nation, basically. I did want to just make a quick point too. One of the things I love about this game in particular, and Days of Wonder's sort of way of thinking about it, is that Days of Wonder makes it official expansions. So you see the American train push is one. There's a European version, but I've played a fan expansion of just the New York subway system, which is really neat. So there's ones that are more collections of different maps you can play on. So not only is this easy to play, but the replayability is super high, which I think is neat and not something we talk about a lot.
So when people think about train games, for people in the know, they either think of 18XX games, which are heavy on the economics, have this Euro component, and there are dozens of them. They're like, oh, this is a really crunchy, long-haul type of game. Or they think of Ticket to Ride, which is really at the other end of the spectrum, even though the theme is still trains.
But very easy to get newcomers in on Ticket to Ride.
Right. Very easy to get newcomers. It's a family game. It's a gateway game into the hobby. You can learn it in 10 minutes. You can play it in half an hour, a little bit more. And where 18XX games, there are dozens of games, and where Ticket to Ride, you have dozens of different iterations. Many people think, either 18XX or Ticket to Ride, and that's the entire train theme genre. And that is just not true. There are there are other train-themed games that are great, especially those with a narrative storytelling element. And there's one in particular that I want to mention here. And I have not played it yet. However, and I know this is a very risky, bold thing to say, I have read a lot about it. I have watched a lot of reviews. I would almost say, and I really shouldn't do this, but I would almost say, without playing it, this might be my game of 2021. Now, after playing it, I could go back on that. I could tank my own credibility. So this is an unofficial game of 2021 from Pete Steele.
You have the microphone, so they will listen to every word you have to say. It is fine.
Vagrant Song is, I've pre-ordered my copy. It should come out any day now. It's by Matt Carter, Justin Gibbs, and Kyle Rowan, published by Weird Miniatures. It is get this, guys, a narrative, scenario-based storytelling game that takes place on a ghost train in the 1920s, and you, the players, enroll vagrants or hobos riding the train.
Oh, good. I'm totally sold. That's all I needed to hear. Ghost Train. We're good.
Is it? Yeah. It's incredible.
It has this chilling trailer or whatever on YouTube.
Oh, I'm sure I've made you both watch this trailer 20 times.
Yes, you have.
And the trailer is, of course, very enchanting and whatnot. But, I mean, aside from the Arkham Horror card game, which is another amazing game, completely different theme and genre and whatnot. But aside from the Arkham Horror card game, I am hard-pressed to come up with another board game that takes place in the 1920s. So, seriously, Vagrant Song. It should come out any day, any week now. Once I get my copy and play it, I'm sure I will mention it again on this podcast. I could be horribly wrong about the game, but hopefully I'm not.
We'll be playing it, that's for sure.
So, guys, we have been talking about a whole bunch of different themes. We have been talking about adventure games. We've been talking about city building and civilization, fighting, economic, political, trains. So I am wondering, well, there are plenty of other themes that we have not mentioned.
And won't have time to mention.
Now might be the time to mention. Rick, what is your favorite theme when it comes to board games?
So my favorite theme has to be fantasy. You're talking magic, dragons. You're talking monsters that you actually stand a chance against. In a fantasy game, the protagonist generally has or can get the power that they need. Bonus points if the wizard knows the power was inside of you all along. In a fantasy game, characters often fit into archetypes like barbarian, mage, or rogue, but not always. I'm going to talk about one game that breaks that mold and breaks most molds, actually. It's a game called Microscope. Came out in 2011, published by Lame Mage Productions. And this is kind of a weird one. Players take turns building a world and modifying each other's work, zooming in and out in scope and back and forth in history. You get big vibes of Tolkien's Silmarillion because you can have hundreds of years pass in a second. We'll talk a little bit about this guy, and then we don't care about him. Let's go to his great-grandkids. You can create a whole pantheon of gods and then talk about the orphan who grew up in one of their temples, and then go back and talk about the king that caused the problem that the orphan is facing right now. It's part game, it's part story writing aid, and if you're playing it with some friends, you'll end up with a fully realized world. Could be fantasy, usually is when I play it, but you could get some sci-fi or something else in there.
So, Rick, I have a question about this. Is that I've never played this game, right? And hearing you talk about it both now and then, you and I have talked about it before. As a gamer, I'm really intrigued, and I say sign me up. But I wonder to people who have not played this type of game before, either because it's fantasy themed or because it's narrative based, that they might think, oh, well, this is kind of all over the place. How do I get into this? It seems kind of chaotic. What would you say to that?
So I haven't played Microscope in a while.
Okay.
But it comes in a very simple book, and it will walk you through all of this. It gives you some convenient places to start. It gives you a way to organize your thoughts. As I recall, it used index cards, and you told you sort of how to stack the index cards so that, okay, we're talking about this world or this country, and this is what's going on in here. It keeps you more or less on track. And as you play more and more, I think you're going to find where you know your way around the world enough where you'll stay on track.
Fair enough.
So, a very different game from most of the other ones we've mentioned, but it's I enjoyed it, and it's definitely worth a shot. So, if you're not up for that, and who could blame you, it is a very crunchy, difficult game to get into. But an easier game to get into is Munchkin.
Oh my goodness. I knew you were going to mention Munchkin.
Which came out in 2001.
So glad you're mentioning Munchkin.
Someone has to mention it. By Steve Jackson Games. So this is a card game. It's based on dungeon crawling. It's got magic weapons. It's got hilarious violence. It's got chainsaws, brutal betrayal. It has more of a slapstick tone as opposed to taking itself seriously, but it explores a lot of these Dungeons and Dragons themes in that sort of different lens.
I would actually, if I may interject,
Please.
I would actually describe Munchkin in the following way. Imagine your first month, your freshman year of college, in the dorms. You drink a 30-pack all by yourself. You go online. You order an airsoft pistol. You go down to the laundry room in the basement of the dorm hall. You find your roommate. You pistol whip them with the airsoft gun that you just bought, and then you hug it out.
Yeah, I'd say that was fair. I always play with my DM from my old D&D game, and he just gets to completely decimate everybody. And it's almost like Munchkin is the perfect revenge for all the players who ruined your perfectly crafted story, is the way I always think about it. But you have fun with it.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
And there are tons of expansions for Munchkin.
Oh yeah, tons of expansions, tons of support. I think it drifts into different types of games entirely if that's what you're into. There's a lot of Munchkin to enjoy.
Fair enough.
And because it's me, we're going to have to talk about Dungeons and Dragons and LARP. Pure roleplay. Lot of options and making your dungeon master wish you were never born. When I play Dungeons and Dragons or when I LARP, I'm almost always a rogue with a little magic to throw some trouble in there. I love the ability to create my character however I want. And however I want is usually it has a little bit borrowed from every class, every different place. I enjoy the ability to grab skills that might be considered a waste because they round me out a little bit. One of my favorite things to hear is one of my fellow players saying, "Wait, you can give last rites?" I can say, "Yeah, I took a night course."
Amazing.
So the other great thing about LARP is because you have all of these options, you have more responsibility for the outcomes. If you're playing a typical board game and the dice don't go your way, well, that happens. But if you let the lich into town because he seemed like a nice guy, that's your fault, and you have to fix that. And it's a really interesting thing to explore in a safe space. In one of my games, my character is ascending the ranks of the militia at a dizzying speed. If we get 2 more people dying, I'm going to be the law in that town. Remember, I always play a rogue. This is not an exception.
Yeah, no, you're going to own everything. It's going to be amazing.
It's terrifying in a good way.
Love it. All right, so Rick is all about fantasy.
I bet I could guess what you're all about, Pete. What are you all about?
Oh, I'm all... if you were to guess, what would you say?
Well, I mean, clearly simulation games involving cooking, or I think I see you mostly play circus-based games. Is that not true?
You got it, yeah. That is in fact not true. I mean, if it
We've
were
already
true...
done pirates.
If it were true, would I admit it here online? I don't know. So... whether or not that is true, what I'm going to go with is I'm all about science fiction games. Give me a spaceship loaded down with lasers, and you've got my heart. If you're in space on a distant planet in an alternate universe with technology, I love it. And I'm going to be honest.
Time travel.
Time travel. when I go into a brick and mortar store looking for a new game just to browse or whatnot, and if I see a new science fiction title, I'm going to be honest, it's not about, oh, sell me on this game, convince me to buy it. I'm always like looking for, how do I not buy this game immediately? Um, that's just what it is. So aside from the specific theme of spaceships and alien planets and technology and different alien cultures, what I love about science fiction games, and this gets a little bit more into game mechanics and themes specifically, so there certainly are exceptions, but typically science fiction games involve variable player powers, so at the outset of the game, different players have different abilities. And this is not unique to the science fiction theme, certainly, but you'll see it very commonly in science fiction. And so this asymmetric game or variable player powers, I think is very compelling. Typically, they have technology trees, which I've already mentioned. I love. Often, science fiction games will deal with economics or direct conflict or area control or a host of other mechanics that combine some of these other things together. And I'm all about it. There's empire building, there's revenge, there's pick up and deliver. But if I'm the starship captain or an admiral, you've got me. You've got me for the evening or the day or the week. So if I'm going to mention a few games, the first game I want to mention is actually Star Trek Ascendancy, which came out in 2016. And as you both know, not only am I a science fiction fan, I am a hardcore Star Trek fan. Have been for 30 plus years.
That's not the understatement of the century. I don't know what is.
Yep.
He's not wrong. It is the understatement of the century. I love it. I'm sure I could name 50 different starship classes by silhouette alone. And that's my nerd disclosure for the day. Yeah. Anywho, so
What's that starship class?
Star Trek Ascendancy is what we're talking about. So it was developed by Aaron Dill, John Kowaleski, and Sean Swigart. Hopefully I'm not butchering that. Published by Gale Force 9. Gale Force 9 does a wonderful job. This is the game publishing company that takes an intellectual property and turns it into a game. This is what they are known for. This is what they're experts at. So Star Trek Ascendancy is for 3 players. It can be played with 2, but you have 3 players playing, 1 player playing the Federation, 1 playing the Romulan Star Empire, and 1 playing the Klingon Empire. It does have expansions. So you can now play as the Cardassians and the Ferengi Alliance, the Vulcan High Command, the Andorian Empire, and you can also play with the Borg. Thank goodness. All hail the Borg Queen. You can also get additional component expansions. You can get faction-specific dice. You can get some more starships called escalation packs. If you want an immersive Star Trek, really Star Trek The Next Generation experience that is all about empire building, this is the game for you. You could very easily drop $400 on the base game and all the expansions, but you don't need to. The base game alone is plenty to have a great experience. The components are good, the art is good, the rule book is good, and easy to read, even if it is long. I would highly recommend it. If you love Star Trek, grab this game. And even if you don't love Star Trek, it's still a good empire building science fiction, almost 4X game.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to mention It's a Wonderful World, which came out in 2019. I'm going to butcher these names so badly. I do apologize. I cannot speak French. But it was created by Frederic Gennard and published by La Boutique Genor Games. Again, I do apologize. I'm sure that's terrible. But it takes place in the not too distant future. This could be 50 or 100 years from now. And it's an engine building game where you draft cards from your opponents and you place them down in front of you and you assemble technology and you assemble resources and you build certain structures or events or creations in order to get resources to build additional structures or events or creations. And you have to ask yourself when you're playing this, are you building a utopia or a dystopia? Or both, if there is such a thing. And there are actually a lot of parallels to what's going on in the world today, and that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm not going to touch that more than that. I will say
5 minutes into the future is a very fun space to explore.
Right. Yeah, I say 50 or 100 years, but it really is 5 minutes into the future, which is kind of cool. I do want to say that, so there is an expansion for the game called Corruption and Ascension, which came out in 2020. I would highly recommend people picking that up as well, but the base game plays just fine without that expansion. You don't need it, but it does add something. A sister game is coming out called It's a Wonderful Kingdom, coming out in 2022, which is going to be strictly a 2-player game. So one versus one, and it takes place in kind of a Renaissance or medieval or fantasy type universe rather than the 5 minutes into the future. But it will have more direct conflict. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, I'm super in. I love the main game.
Yeah.
And the idea of a 2-player game is really intriguing to me.
Yeah, I'm in.
Yeah, I'm really excited for it to come out. I did not back it on Kickstarter, but I'm going to try and pre-order the game when it comes out, before it comes out. If I can mention one more game very briefly.
Okay.
Oh, hey, thanks. This is a game that I did kickstart, and I kickstarted probably a couple years ago, that just came out due to COVID and production issues and shipping issues. It took forever to come out, but it finally did. And this is a game called Overbattle the All War. And I just got my copy. Actually, I'm going to be honest, I ordered 2 copies. By Sither Gaming, developed by Rob McBride. Did y'all ever play the computer games either Total Annihilation or Supreme Commander or Planetary Annihilation?
Sure did.
Afraid not.
So those games they're not all by the same company. But they really are by the same group or subgroup of developers. I'm going to say that. I hope I don't get into trouble by saying that.
I think that's pretty accurate. Well known.
It's pretty accurate, right? It is pretty accurate. So, Rick, imagine a underdeveloped version of StarCraft with much worse graphics, but 5 times the units and 10 times the scope, and almost no theme, and it's all about, I hate that team because they're colored blue and we're colored red, and we're gonna just blow them out of existence, and that's all that it's about.
Sure. Sounds fun.
So Overbattle the All War is basically Planetary Annihilation or Total Annihilation or Supreme Commander, the board game. That's what it is. And I would imagine the designer, Rob McBride, would say, hey, I have more theme and more narrative and more lore than that. It's like, okay, yes, you do. But I would say it also doesn't matter. That's not what your game is actually about, whether you realize it or not. Rob McBride, you can DM me, tell me I'm wrong. We can get into it, and that'll be a lot of fun. The point is, I bought 2 copies of your game. I'm recommending it. I love it. It is hard to get to the table because the board is larger than my queen-size quilt on my bed.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, it's massive. It's absolutely massive.
This has been a thing I've been worried about with like real-time strategy, RTS type games, going to board games for a while is this exact problem, which, it's a good problem to have. I'm sure it's beautiful and well designed, but I've always wondered about that with like, oof.
I definitely do want to do a full review of Overbattle the All War on our website, on the Corex and Coffee website. However, the rule book is 70 pages and it's an early iteration. It's kind of a mess. I hope Rob McBride comes out with better versions of the rulebook in the future, which he said he will, but stay tuned for that because that will be coming. So that's me in science fiction. Keegan, what about you?
Oh boy, howdy.
I mean, just like you guessed for me, I'm going to guess for you.
Oh, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm going to guess that you enjoy playing games where you sit down and you cooperatively with all of your little friends build like a garden, maybe in Iceland, and have like little travel boxes and like you're like harvesting herbs to make a pizza or something.
And you wouldn't be wrong necessarily. it's okay to be cooperative. I just appreciate if my cooperation has more zombies or body parts, just to like immediately cover up what that could mean. I'm a huge horror fan, and at the risk of sitting here and talking for the next like, oh, I don't know, 7 hours about horror as a theme, I'm just gonna kind of try to keep it as brief as possible. So first off, like, when I say horror, I mean it as like a very broad category, right? Like for board games, this could be something as simple as like zombies and ghosts that fit under like a broad umbrella with lots of mechanics. We talked about this a little bit at the top of the episode. But I'm also okay, like I also really like things that are like more subtle. Haunted spaceships, this ghost train game sounds awesome. Or something as simple as the mechanic of like permadeath, so that you're kind of always in this anxious, I don't want my character to die thing. Horror, I just think has so much nuance, and I love it, and it's great. And I think what I love about it is that tension. But I also prefer themes. Obviously can inform design as well. They don't always, but they can. And I prefer things that are darker colors or goopier looking. Elder Sign's a really good example of this. Arkham Horror is a little pretty and more gothic, whereas like Elder Sign's a little dirtier and grimier and kind of fun to look at. And just to all game designers who are clearly listening to us, if your game is like a send up to 80s horror, I'm going to buy like 12 copies of it without asking questions, just so you know. I'll be honest about that.
And Keegan, based on what I know about you, and you can tell me I'm wrong, but I would almost argue that for you, I mean, you do like the surface level horror, especially 80s horror, because you're a child of the 80s, right?
Yeah.
But
oh yeah, I think that's totally fair.
I would say good horror, and especially horror that you are drawn to, again, based on what I know of you, really has an existential undertone and is dealing with themes of freedom and loneliness and meaning and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I'd say that was totally fair. And part of that we can blame on my profession in like psychology. Part of that we can but like I agree with you, Pete. I think that like I like metagaming. I think when I really thought about this episode, thought about talking to you guys about this and why I like horror, I think you're hitting the nail on the head here. Is I really love the meta, the outside the game, the things that like go bump the night, but also cause this tension and terror and tension breaking is also really important. I don't know if that really addresses what you're saying, but I agree with you, I guess, is my point.
Fair enough.
So one thing I enjoy about horror is, and it's one of the differences between horror and fantasy, right? Is you can have zombies in a fantasy game, but in a fantasy game, you generally have the power of the gods to like blast them and go away. In horror, there's none of that. In horror, there's, okay, we beat that zombie, but we beat it using 3 bullets, and they're not making any more bullets, so
yeah,
that's a problem.
Oh yeah, no, I think that's a great, and I want to differentiate it from. In another episode, maybe we can talk about the differences here. I do also love survival games, but to differentiate it, because your point brings up a thing that I do also love games that, of course, like limit your resources and that you have to like craft new ones. Because that also creates its own tension. But I really like the idea of like the lack of bullets is one thing, but the reality is my brain's going to get eaten. Like, I don't know. I just like that. I like that fear. And for the same reason that some people might like.
Right. I beat this zombie. Yeah. I can't beat all
exactly. And it's just a matter of like, how can I achieve my goal? I also like the idea of the environment being. I play a lot of combative games, so like Pete kind of alluded to this earlier. The fighting games are a good example of this. And I like the idea that, yes, I am competing against another player, but I like the idea of like shaky alliances as well as a really fun game. Semi-cooperative would be the, I guess, correct term to use here. And horror seems to do really well with that. Yeah, and I like the hidden mechanics stuff because like the world itself is oppressive, and I really appreciate that. A couple of games that actually like immediately jump to mind here that are kind of similar in some ways and different others. The game Bloodborne, the 2021 official non-Kickstarter release version is what I have, based on a 2016 card game of the same name, which is also in turn based off of a PlayStation exclusive game Bloodborne. So if that's what you're thinking of, it's... And Bloodborne has a reputation that we could discuss for years and years and years, but I'll stick to the board game version. But I think about that game, and I think about the game Betrayal on the Hill from 2004. And I'll stick to Bloodborne first to kind of talk about it. But one of the things I love about this game is that, so Bloodborne was created by Eric M. Lang and Michael Chanel, I believe is how you pronounce that. Published by Come On, so CMON, Global Limited, and Asmodee. These producers do a lot in the miniatures world. So if you see Asmodee or CMON, you're seeing a giant, great big box with incredibly detailed miniatures. That is what you're going to see.
Tons of miniatures.
Yeah, and Bloodborne is no exception. The creatures in Bloodborne are what is it with it? Gross Lovecraftian monsters fighting hunters, battling for their lives and their sanity in the dream of an old dead god. So it's very chipper.
Oh, is that all?
Bloodborne is a really fun game though, because it is like this cooperative game where you and your fellow hunters are fighting against monsters and completing these hunts, almost in like a story narratives way. There's a set of quests you have to complete each level, so to speak. Mm-hmm. One really cool thing about this game that we haven't really talked much about, is that it's a 1 to 4 player game, meaning that it is a solo game. And I don't have a lot of people to play board games with, since Pete, you moved to Tulsa, and Rick, you and I live across literally on the complete opposite ends of the United States.
Sure.
And my friend...
I keep trying to scooch further, but there's water there.
I appreciate that you reach, at least. So one thing that's really cool about Bloodborne is it is a game that you can play solo, which I think also adds to the horror element, which is also really neat. You can kind of be by yourself, set up your own atmosphere with music and that kind of, and you aren't having to compete with players as well. So that's just a cool thing I like about this sort of campaign.
Must do wonders for the replayability too.
Oh yeah, a ton, because all the hunters are a little bit different and have a little bit different abilities. The monsters are randomly generated. There's a boss at the end of each one that's the same, but you can really get a lot of play out of it. Mm-hmm. There's also 4...
But playing it by yourself must be different than playing
Yes, very, very different. And there's also 3 or 4 giant expansions that are also great. The game is just really cool. And and that's why it's horror. As I said, it is this living in the dream of a dead god. And then it also has this very washed out color scheme as well. And this is kind of one of those situations where theme really does invite and manipulate the overall design of the game in a really cool way. So it's a pricey game. I think it's somewhere in the 109 currently on Amazon or something like that, but it's worth it. It's a really, really beautifully complete game. And the rule book is long, but also really easy to walk through. It does tutorial stuff, which is really nice.
Nice.
Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, but still in these things that I love about horror, is Betrayal on the House on the Hill, which I mentioned. So I have Bruce Glasgow, Rob DeVenow, Bill McQuillan, Mike Selnicker, and Tewin Woodruff, I believe is how you pronounce that. Or Tevin Woodruff. If I'm, again, pronouncing that incorrectly, I'm sorry. Your game is amazing. This is by Avalon Hill Games, and Asmodee makes an appearance here because they make great miniatures. But I would be remiss, as much as it pains me to admit, this is also produced by Wizards of the Coast, and I believe Hasbro is currently taking on Betrayal.
I think that's right.
But this is a game which, again, is horror. It's 3 to 6. It's another, but this is a game where that semi-cooperative gets stressed really hard. I think we've talked about this a little bit.
Boy, does it.
Oh, yeah. So this is a game where, you do want to get 3 to 6 players. 5 to 6 is really your best. Play is about an hour long. And this is it starts out as a cooperative game where you and your friends are kind of Scooby-ganging through a haunted house. You're mapping out a haunted house using tiles. You're sort of looking around and exploring. And then a twist comes. And the twists are very random. I don't want to get into too many of them. There are a lot of them. Talk about replayability. Mm-hmm. Holy crap.
Yeah.
And there's also just a ton of expansions that further make these games bigger and bigger and bigger. But the twist turns one of your players into the bad guy, for lack of a better term. I don't want to give too much away because it's the experience of what each of these experiences is like. But basically, one of you becomes a bad guy, and that's secret information. And the bad guy's job is to various jobs, kill somebody, take their soul, whatever. The basics.
Tuesday.
Yeah, and it's just really, really cool. So the horror comes not only from this like stumbling through a haunted house and being a part of this universe, but it comes from the fact that somebody in your group is a betrayer. And my favorite version of this is when sometimes the betrayal isn't real, and that's all I'll say on that subject. But Rick, I think you and I have sort of like shared a conversation about a couple of these mechanics where the bad guy is theoretical, for lack of a better term.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great game in that this is not only secret information, it's randomized and nobody knows it. So it's not that the betrayer is running around and saying, ha ha ha, I'll get you later. They don't know. Suddenly they touch the wrong thing and they get taken over and now they're against you.
Yeah.
And maybe helping them earlier get out of that trap, maybe that really comes back to bite you. But what are you going to do? Just not help your friends?
Exactly, because there is permadeath in this game too. Like part of that, the horror of looking through the haunted house is that things in the haunted house can kill you. So on top of all of this, like,
and I think Betrayal and the House in the Hill, because it's a game that is still very much in publication and available to people who want to purchase it. It's a great gateway game of a type. It's not really a gateway game, but it's a gateway game into this type of betrayal horror genre. And then if people want to get into more complex, kind of more modern games that were built on the shoulders of this giant of Betrayable House on a Hill, they can get into games like Nemesis.
Really, any world, like, 1v all game. I mean, there are Juggernaut style games that you see, like Nemesis being one that comes to mind, but like Alien, one of the Alien iterations where someone is playing as the aliens, or any game where you're playing as sort of the creator of chaos for your game group.
Right.
I think lastly, one last little quick one. So the one thing about Betrayal and Bloodborne I do want to point out is both games are fairly large, and Pete, I think you very eloquently sort of like played with that idea of like, well, this is not exactly a starter game, because it isn't, right? Like there are a bunch of expansions. There's a lot of ways in. There's a lot of open gateways that this game creates, but it's also, they're expensive. You need to have a lot of players. So one game I do want to quickly throw in there, and it's kind of, this is a place where horror as a theme is more broad. It's gothic horror. It's called Gloom from 2005. Have you guys heard of this game?
Oh, sure have.
Yeah, I love this game. Rick, have you ever heard of this one?
No, afraid not.
So Gloom is awesome. It's by Keith Baker and done by Atlas Games. I'm a really big fan of Atlas Games in general because they produce a lot of two-player, especially taking to the table, sort of for our benefit. They create a lot of games that are good for like cafe play for various reasons. Either they're small, or in this case in Gloom, the components are really pretty. They're these kind of see-through plastic cards that, like, if you dumped an entire latte on, they're easy to clean. You can just throw them in the water. The ink is really well put on there. It's just really, really nice components, which I like. But Gloom is this game. It's about 2 to 4 players, about an hour of playtime again, where you're trying to cause as much grievous sadness and ennui on your family of misfits as possible, all while trying to make sure your opponents have only beautiful and wonderful things happening to them. It's this game that creates a moment where someone, like, I'm trying to make my character have the worst time ever and then die, so that locks in that character's like experience and life story, and the sadder life story wins. But Rick could be across from me and be like, I could be saying, oh, this guy was about to be eaten by badgers, and I'm like, on my next turn I'm going to kill him. I've got this great score. It's called your pathos score. But then Rick looks over at me and he's like, don't worry, Keegan. Before all this happens, he goes skipping through a land of daisies, which then, of course, lowers the score of my character. And so I have this moment where I'm really angry that you're being so helpful.
Yeah. Yep.
It's just like, basically, it's the first game I've ever played where the nicer you are to your opponents, the worse person you actually are in who you are. Yourself.
Which is really a great mechanic. It's really a great mechanic.
Yeah, it really, really is. It's a game where I have like seen people like do that gritted teeth, like, this happens, Thank you. That's so polite. There's actually some house rules where like you're supposed to thank players for saving your life. It's basically if Edward Gorey and Sylvia Plath had like a sad-off, this would be the game that was created. And to the point, like, why is it horror? It's gothic horror. So this is more about like, as funny as it is, gothic horror is this idea of crushing sadness and untimely death, and plays with this idea of like, not so much existential dread, but just the dreaded, the unbearable lightness of being, which is the single nerdiest joke I've made on this entire episode. But that's what it is, and it's just really cool. And Gloom is also really fun because it sticks to its PG-13-ish rating. So it is gloomy and sad and depressing, but one thing that keeps it funny and light is that it's not super dark. Like you could play this, I think, with like a teenager or even someone in like their 10, 11 range. One big criticism that gets lobbied at horror, and I think is fair for Betrayal and Bloodborne, is that horror tends to be more of an older kid's world. And I think Gloom is a nice, like, if you've got kind of that weird dark kid in your family, but you want him to be included, this is a good place for that.
Well, this is really where tone comes in as well, right? Which we talked about at the beginning, in that you can have this horror theme, but it can still be age appropriate for younger ones because the tone is lighter or the setting is sillier.
And I think just the idea that you're chasing the horror and chasing the bad things is a neat trick to change that tone up quite a bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you get a lot of mastery over what's happening. And just to kind of pitch this too, there's other themes as well in this that cover this game, other settings. There's a Cthulhu version, which I think is super fun, and it's again another really nice, like, silly way to show off the Cthulhu mythos in a way that's more, again, family friendly. But also there's a Game of Thrones version. Which is super fun because that's the gimmick, right? That everyone has a terrible life and then dies.
Usually very quickly.
Yeah. So this is a pretty fun. So those, I just love horror.
So we've been talking about theme and setting and tone, and we've been talking about a number of themes, but there are a whole host, dozens and dozens, that we have not had time to talk about in this particular podcast. And we've talked about our favorite themes, but why do games have themes at all? Why is that a thing? Why is it needed?
Well, Pete, I'll tell you.
Okay, tell me, Rick. Lay it on me.
So themes can guide people in how you're supposed to play the game. So one example I'm thinking of is this game Titanic by Spin Masters Games in 2020. It has a theme of the sinking ship, Titanic. And as the ship sinks, levels of the ship become inaccessible from the bottom up. Because it's got this theme of a sinking ship, that's very intuitive and very easy to understand of, oh, there's water down there, I can't go there. Whereas if you're trying to make this an abstract game, that might be more difficult for people to grasp. Another good reason that you have themes is it encourages people to buy the game and helps them enjoy it. People probably wouldn't buy a game about collecting resources from a shrinking board, but setting the game on the Titanic makes it more appealing to a lot of people.
It's more relatable in many ways.
Exactly.
Although there are some games, which you've already talked about, Project L, which we talked about earlier in the episode, does not have a theme. And a theme would do it harm. You know, if the theme were, oh, you have to assemble all these pieces to gain points to stop the monsters from coming, that would be ridiculous and detract from the overall gameplay.
Sure. However, my wife wanted to play Titanic and would probably have no interest in Project L.
And that's totally fair. Totally fair.
Well, I think that kind of hits a really important point, is that a good theme or a well-executed theme can make you forgive a lot of things about a game that maybe you would have a harder time with. Like there's a reason, and I would argue maybe this isn't a great idea, but there's a reason that things like themed versions of Monopolies outsell versions of like Monopoly in some areas.
Right.
Or there's reasons that like a theme will make you, a good theme, a good story, a good experience will make you forgive a lot of crimes.
Right.
So yes, there are definitely games that would be hurt by it, but there I think are really a lot of games that benefit from having a good theme. I'm not going to say anything right now because I'm being kind of negative, but you know what I'm talking about.
I'm going to be positive. Theme can be a great way to get people into board games. Rick, you're talking about, if your wife Christina loves the story of Titanic, either historically or some of the fictionalized versions, and you say, hey, here's a board game that is on the Titanic theme, that might be a bridge to say, oh, I'd love to play that game because I love this world, this story, this theme.
Exactly.
But theme can also be a barrier to getting people into the tabletop gaming hobby, because there's the stereotype that we are trying to dispel, along with many other people in the community, that gamers are nerds who like spaceships and goblins on spaceships. And that is certainly a huge component. And there are many games that are based on those themes, but there are many other themes as well. Mm-hmm. If you can think of a theme, there is almost certainly a board game that either has been made around it or could be made around it or whatnot. And I think it would be interesting to do a whole episode on the future about how do we both leverage humans' love of theme and story to get them into board gaming, use it as a bridge, but also how do we identify when theme is a barrier to getting people into board games. If we think of, a Frank. If Frank loves a particular type of mechanic, but has only heard of board games with that mechanic that have goblins, Frank's like, oh, I don't like goblins. I think that's silly and ridiculous, so I'm not going to play. Sure. It's like, well, hey, here's another board game with that same mechanic that is about building a rose garden. And Frank says, well, I love roses. I'm actually an armchair botanist. We're like, fantastic. Now we're playing and drinking lattes, and that's great. So I think an episode on that would be fantastic.
And as we've already talked about, when we talked about Secret Hitler, some themes are just off-putting.
And if your people are turned off to it, they're never going to see it.
In any event, we have lots more to talk about. Keegan, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We'd love to have you back anytime.
Absolutely. I mean, you guys are going to hear my voice at the end of all of our things while we're progressively go crazier and crazier and crazier as time goes on.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm telling myself my own little inter-theme story.
So this is going to bring us to the end of episode 3. In episode 4, Rick and I are going to be back, and we are actually going to talk about different types of board game components, the positives and negatives of different types of components, and specifically what types of components may be more conducive to different types of mechanic and telling different types of stories.
Because much like theme, different components can attract or repel different players. So using those strategically is going to be helpful. So thank you for joining us today. Please like and subscribe. Please consider visiting our website at www.coraxandcoffee.com. As we're recording this, we just launched it, and we're so excited about that. And consider supporting us on the Patreon or through our merch store.
Until next time, I'm your host, Pete Steele.
I'm your other host, Rick Hendricks.
And I'm just some guy named Keegan.
Take care, all.
Take care, everybody. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. But it was a pretty good podcast. Thank you for listening to the Corax and Coffee Cast with your indomitable hosts, Pete Steele and Rick Hendricks, with special guest, Keegan King. Wait, that's me. Does this make this third person? Isn't that kind of silly? No? Okay. Keegan King is responsible for music, audio production, and general mischief. Thanks to our other amazing contributors, Sarah Vasa and Miss Shaw. If you liked this podcast, you may like our other content, like game unboxing videos, written game reviews, and print and play game content, all available at coraxandcoffee.com. Please also consider following us on social media, signing up for our newsletter for interesting and behind-the-scenes content, visiting our merch store, and becoming a Patreon supporter in whatever amount you think our content is worth. The quote of the week: no new horror can be more terrible than the daily torture of the commonplace. Corax and Coffee. Tabletop gaming, caffeinated.